Welcome to a Gyan Darshan session from the Sociology faculty. Today I'll be talking about the colonial view of India. This is part 2. Previously I talked about colonial view of India, largely in the context of what we consider are some of the Indologist and the Orientalist perspective as well. So just to recap what we have already discussed, let me just give a very brief going back to what the colonial perspective is. Basically, when we talk about a colonial view of India, we are talking about a certain viewpoint which emerged out of the fact that we were colonized for nearly 300 years and various people were very interested in India as a landscape and its socio-cultural, aspects. So one perspective emerged, which we call the Orientalist perspective. I had already mentioned that some of the understanding with which the Orientalists went about their study of India was that they privileged or they highlighted the textual nature of Indian culture. They relied largely on Sanskrit-based text. And they also felt that some of the ideological aspects of Indian culture had predominantly guided Indian society and its social structure, social organization, and so on and so forth. Some of these ideas influenced many sociologists. I mentioned Dumont, for instance. When Dumont talks about caste system, for instance, he says the idea of purity, pollution, or even the Varna system, which is an ideological framework, also ruled much of the way we as in India, we organize our social systems or our social organizations. So this viewpoint, as I already mentioned, we not only influenced Dumont, but many other sociologists. Notable, I think, among them is Courier, Iravati Karve, so on and so forth. The Orientalist perception also kind of is seen in the way subsequent work was also undertaken. For instance, administrators. So I think today I'll talk about two other elements of the colonial view, which is the administrators who worked on India or who worked in India and then who also wrote on India or who collected a lot of data and compiled a sort of compendiums on Indian culture and structures. So there was the administrators as well as the missionaries. So in today's discussion and lecture, I will talk mainly about these two aspects of colonial view. Now, let me start with the missionaries. I think the missionaries pretty much came with the East India Company, but their activities increased even more so in by 19th century and continued till 20th century, and one can say that missionary influence continues to be seen even in independent India. Now, the missionaries, many of them who are evangelists, that is, people who want to spread Christianity in what is largely a Hindu country or Hindu population, or for that matter, even many Islamic communities, felt that the need to translate the Bible into vernacular would be really helpful. Now, to translate the Bible would then require some facility with the language. So it's very interesting that in around this time, there was a lot of translation work that was undertaken of the Bible. And as a result, there was a lot of interest in the language itself. And you would find that some of the missionaries, in their effort to translate the Bible, also ended up working on the vernacular languages. So, for instance, there was a British missionary by the name of Cotton who did a substantial amount of work on Telugu language. And that's just an example. And there are many such examples. So the Bible was translated into some of the vernacular languages, and that really also was the starting point in some ways for the missionaries to take interest in the Indian cultural landscape or the social landscape. What is also interesting is that in an effort to find some problems with Hinduism, which should be the basis for people to convert to Christianity, they also needed to undertake studies of some of the ancient texts, or whether it is Puranas or Dharma Shastras or even the epics. So that effort also happened. But their viewpoint, unlike the Orientalists who believed that there was a superior thought process, a higher level of thought process in the Indian philosophical tradition or even in the sacred textual tradition, the missionaries, on the other hand, believed that there was nothing to recommend in terms of religion, and that they thought that Hinduism was riddled with absurdities, strange rituals, habits and customs and so on. So their logic or their perspective with which they looked at India was very different. In fact, reading some of these ancient texts, they argued that, if anything, that some of the heathens who they felt were very primitive needed to be converted. So the missionary outlook on India was very different, and that zeal with which they came, which is to convert, in a way paved the way for a certain kind of viewpoint of India, a denigration of the Hindu culture, but also many ways which they found unsuitable for a civilized country. Now, I won't go into too many details, but some of the morality that was associated with Christianity or Christian morality also seeped into many aspects and then were internalized by some of the, the native population, so to say. And this was one viewpoint which continued to inform subsequent studies, even sociological studies or studies of certain organizations or institutions in the Indian society. Take, for example, Metcalfe, who completely denigrated Indian villages. I think he also comes from a viewpoint which necessarily is not a missionary, but comes from a viewpoint that there was nothing to recommend in terms of its value or its contribution to culture in terms of Indian society. These ideas, you will find, have somehow seeped into how we continue to look at India. And that is why we often say that, we have been colonized, or that our minds have been colonized by these certain viewpoints. This is as far as missionaries are concerned, but also the administrators were interested to understand the colonies that they ruled. It's very interesting that wherever the British went, and the administrators were very active in undertaking large-scale studies, because, when posted at districts as collectors or even as railway officers, they were very actively involved in the day-to-day administration, but also into the lives and everyday aspects of the society that they were living in. And not necessarily all of them produced treatises on India or very researched books, but there were a whole lot of literature also that came out of this administrator's, involvement in India. I mean, for instance, the fact that Jim Corbett, who was an administrator, also wrote very lovingly, of course, on Indian society, whether it was, little anecdotes from his stay in Kumaon region or about the village life or individuals that he's met. Of course, he wrote in a very generous tone. He was fond of India, but not every one of them was taking that kind of viewpoint. So many administrators were interested not because they happened to be living in India, but they were interested in trying to understand the society because they wanted to rule it better. And so large-scale studies were taken. I think it was also around the time that, you had rivers working on the Andaman Islands, even Radcliffe Brown. Elsewhere, you'll find that the colonists had ended up being anthropologists. Evans Pritchard, who was posted in Africa, was a colonial administrator who became an avid anthropologist in some sense and eventually became a professor. But he started out his life as an administrator. So, and the colonial administration also produced a range of writings which were based on fieldwork. So the large-scale surveys were done. They were more organized. They were very meticulously, generated a lot of fact-based information. This was also the time when they started to take large-scale census data. In fact, Nicholas Dirk, in one of his books, I will mention the name of the book. You'll find that in our unit as well. His book, which is called Castes of the Mind, Colonialism and the Making of Modern India. Nicholas Dirks argues that it was actually the British who categorized Indian social formations or Indian social categories so strictly that he actually says it was the castes of the mind, which means the caste got more concretized during the British rule. And he argues that it was the Portuguese who used the word caste, and the British took it further and then started to categorize people into various caste groups. Very interestingly, when the census was taken up, a lot of people found it, I think it was the first time that they could actually be officially categorized. Before that, there was no official categorization. You had categories, of course. They were socially available. They were socially practiced. But if you go into more of the details of the census operations during the British or the first census, which happened in the 1930s, you'd find a very interesting fact that some of the people actually petitioned that they should be included in this particular caste. One can easily do a sociological analysis of this and find that maybe around this time people could use this as a way to move out of a particular caste and move into another one. That is one aspect, but what Nicholas Dirks is also arguing is that the caste got concretized, which also makes us wonder if the castes were a little more fluid in nature, a little more flexible, not quite like the Sanskritization concept which M.N. Srinivas proposes, but in a way that one could have a certain boundarylessness. But because it was officially recognized, then you get bounded by it. Now, this is a topic for debate and discussion, but some of you might be interested in the issue of caste as an open-ended system or a very closed system would be interested to know. What is also interesting is we find that caste groups in actuality work around the concept of jati, which is, as we discovered when we were discussing Indologist view, for instance, when we were referring to Dumont, we were talking about how Dumont takes a viewpoint which keeps as his basis an ideological framework, which is a sort of a mental map of how caste can be seen. Now, in reality, subsequent anthropological work that was done on caste systems in post-independent India, or even for that matter, recent works and so on, all argue that castes are actually power groups as well, in the sense caste should be also seen in relation to the kind of power that they wield in the local context. So whether it is Bailey's work or subsequently, even for that matter, M.N. Srinivas, who talks about dominant caste, should be seen in the light of these power structures. Andre Bete also talks about that. So we see that in some measure, the work of British administrators or missionaries, while they laid the foundations for some of the, or the basis for some of the things that we carried forward, it also helps us to re-examine, the subsequent work helps us to re-examine some of the foundational work that has been done by the colonialist, whether it is missionaries or administrators. Now, the administrative work that was done also led to, as we mentioned, with reference to the missionaries, that it was done in such a way that actually there was, it kind of give a fillip or a sort of a lift to the vernacular language. Now, the interest in vernacular language, both by missionaries, administrators, or the colonialists in general, and when I say colonialist, not only am I talking about British colonists, but the colonial interest as such, that's why we are calling it the colonial view, spread or has influenced various thinkers, scholars who came to India to study. So there are many Indologists or Orientalists who are actually German and who even now continue to take interest in the ancient traditions of India and the Sanskritic-based literature that comes out of India. So, so as I was saying, colonial view is something that was not limited only to the colonials or the colonists, but also can be seen in scholars who came to India. But it was also internalized by many scholars from India who were influenced by the writings, whether it is by administrators or early sociological thinkers, and so on and so forth. So this interest in India, in a way, created a self-conscious awareness of what India is. And in a way, it laid the groundwork for a subsequent nationalist movements, sort of interest in India, pride in India, sort of a rising consciousness. This was also the time, I think, by about late 19th century, 20th century, and so on, with the advancement in print technologies and production of vernacular literature and the proliferation of the press and so on and so forth. You might have read in your school textbooks as well how the vernacular literature, how the vernacular press influenced the nationalist movement a great deal. So one can say that the pride that the Orientalists took in ancient India can also be seen in some of the nationalist leaders, whether we talk about Tilak, for instance, or for that matter, Gandhi, who also was very actively interested in the deep-seated value systems, ideological frameworks, or even religious values in the Indian subcontinent, India, for instance. And so we can say that the colonialists in general paved the way for a consciousness in India, and the administrative work, which was some of it very dry and strictly oriented to administrative purposes, also helped in documenting, categorizing, but also creating a whole set of administrative setups, which paved the way in terms of sort of connecting India in terms of distances, but also laying the foundation for communication across distances, across religious differences, across caste lines, across regional differences. So the administrative setup, which is purely material in terms of, whether it is putting of the railway networks, whether it is printing press or telegraph systems, so on, and also were an outcome of a sort of an outcome which also led to a certain viewpoint, which united in India in many ways, and that led to a certain viewpoint of India, which is to see India as a nation and to see this very fragmented, disconnected sense of geography one had. If people were to, if one were to ask anyone, what is your sense of Desh, for instance, many times people would refer to their immediate locality. It could be sometimes even as small as a village or a sort of a region. But the idea of a Desh really emerged when you experience a sense of the vast land, which otherwise was not reaching to them, but can now be accessed or is reaching to them through the media of print. In fact, there is a sociologist, Benedict Anderson, who says that print capitalism, or the fact that there was large-scale printing as an activity and as an economic activity, created its own sense of understanding of geographical space, which in turn resulted in people feeling that they are part of a nation. And that feeling, or that feeling that you are part of a larger community, was a result of all these efforts by both administrators, colonialists, missionaries, and so on and so forth. So in some ways, the Indologists, the colonialists, the administrators, and the missionaries together created a compendium of work, some of which is highly prejudiced, comes from a certain perspective which was coming from very strategic reasons of how to control, how to rule, how to govern the large, vast landscape. But what it resulted is in creating a sort of a dissemination of ideas about the idea of India as a nation, which also produced, as I mentioned, a sense of we feeling, a sort of a consciousness about what it is to be Indian. So the offshoots of these kind of work that we notice is also the foundation for sort of subsequent nationalist movements, and of course some were highly influenced by the Orientalist thought process. So people eulogized or would say felt that the glorious past of India was something to be celebrated. So a lot of revival also took place around this time in 19th century, particularly so in the early 20th centuries. You'll find many religious reform movements which didn't want to really completely reject some of the established practices, but wanted to go back to what they thought was a glorious past. So, which often is situated to Vedantic periods and so on and so forth. So you'll find that some of the reform movements happened around this time, And one particular example I can give you is the Arya Samaj, Dayanand Saraswati's Arya Samaj. So we can say that in a concluding way, we can say that the colonialist view is not restricted only to some of the categories that I mentioned. It's a viewpoint that kind of seeped into the scholars who came to India to study, whether it is Max Muller or subsequent people. But also it was internalized by many of the founding fathers of post-independent India, but also very active members of the social movements, reform movements, as well as the nationalist movements. You can read more of these in our unit, in our course on Indian society, myth and realities, images and realities. So I think hopefully next time you'll have more detailed insights into some of these things that I have just narrated to you. Thank you.